we're finishing up in the book of Acts, and we're going to be, next week is going to be our last message in the book of Acts. And the reality is it's been a long journey for the Apostle Paul. It's been a long journey for the Christians, but yet at the same time, it was just the beginning. And I remember, even in my own life, that when I got saved, it just seemed like such a long time ago, but it was really just the beginning. And now it's really just the beginning of what God is doing for me in my own life, even right now. And if you think about it, even in your, God is doing something new, God is doing something special, God is doing some work, but it's a process, and it's a time where He's taking us through, and He's bringing us to a place where He wants us to be. But there's things that happen along the way. There's things that are going to go on along the way. But one thing that God has shown me in my own life is that what He promised, He said that He would do, He's going to complete and He's going to finish all the way to the end. And He's going to do it. And you think about that in your own life. You think about how God started even in your own life, in your relationship, in your walk with Him. The reality is that there's going to be a finish time. There's going to be a time. There's a purpose. There's a goal. There's a thing in the end that He wants to accomplish. Think about that for your own life. And what happens when you're approaching and you're getting there, and you're completing and you're finishing the goal? Are you finishing strong? Well, today we're going to look at the Apostle Paul. We're going to look at how Paul was in the midst of a great storm that we saw last week, and how Paul trusted God to bring him through the storm. And others listened to him at that moment and said, we're going to trust what you have to say, Paul, and we're going to do what you say, because Paul spoke for God. And what happened? And then we're going to see that they were brought safely through. And that's where it brings us up to today, is that, well, this is on the closing, near to the end of the journey for Paul. But the reality was, it wasn't the end, but it was really just the beginning for Paul. So let's look. We're going to look at three specific points here. We're going to look at one, brought safely through, bitten by a viper, and then healings and provision. Our first point, Acts chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. Brought safely through. So we hear last week, for those of you who were here last week, we saw that they were in a great, tremendous storm. And it was kind of ironic because it was the same time when the storm was going on down in the south. And the reality is that the people on the boat were scared, they were afraid, and they were trying to do some things to escape. But Paul said, if you try and escape, no one will be saved. But we see that during this time, there was rough waters, there was wind, the boat was being tossed back and forth. But God instructed them to run the ship ashore, run it into to where it's going to stop, so we can get to shore safely. This is what you are to do. And so what ends up happening is that we saw that in the end, everyone grabbed a piece of the ship, ran into the ground, ran into a reef, and the ship started breaking apart. But then everybody grabbed something, and everybody floated to the island. There was an island there. And this is what brings us here to verse 1 of chapter 28. It says, and when they had been brought safely through. The reality was, if you look last week, Paul said that if you do what I say, the ship, you'll have loss, but everyone will be saved. And so this is a fulfillment of what? Of what the Lord had said through Paul. And as people listened to what the Lord was saying through Paul, their lives were what? They were spared. And so they were brought safely through to this island. And the island was called Malta. Now, Malta is there. It's in the midst. It's between Sicily. If you look in the Mediterranean, it's between Sicily and the North African coast. And it's still a tourist destination. But over the history and over the years, there have been occupations of different peoples that have been there. But it's a popular tourist destination now. From what I understand from my reading, it's a lovely island. But as they go here, this is where God had brought them, and this is where God had provided for Paul and for the people on the ship. They would land in Malta, and this is how God is so cool. It says, the island was called Malta, and verse 2, what had happened here as they landed on this island? Everybody was expected to die, everybody was expected to not come safely through, but what happens? The natives show what? Extraordinary kindness. In other words, the natives of the island, those who were living on the island at that time. They showed extraordinary kindness to them. Rather than facing death and persecution and whatever other kinds of things could have happened, they were shown kindness. And this is just a testament to the Lord, is that when you do the Lord's work and you're obedient to what He says, He takes care of you. And He provides for you. But also, not only does He provide for you, but He'll make sure that your needs are met. And He'll show you favor. Think about that. How here they could have been treated any old way, but the people do what? He lands on an island where the people are kind, and they show kindness to Paul. Think about this even in our own lives. As God has called us to do something, and we hit adversity, and we hit trials, and we hit difficulties, but God brings us safely through, but then God allows us to be shown favor by what? By people, by His kindness through other people, and we experience His kindness as we continue, as we do His work. It's not just saying it's always going to be rough and it's always going to be difficult, but God's going to take care of us, and this is the main point. God will always take care of us on the journey along the way, and God will always meet us and provide for us along the way, just like He did with the Apostle Paul. They brought him safe to the island, and now that they're bringing him safe to the island, what is he doing? He's allowing the people on the island to show him kindness. Because God's purpose will be accomplished. I have a purpose in my life that God has called me to do, and God's called me to complete, and God's called me to finish. God has a purpose for each of us individually. Whether we believe that or not, whether we understand that or not, there is a purpose, there is a plan that God has for each one of us that He wants us to accomplish, and He wants us to finish. But again, as I've been saying, we need to be obedient to what God's saying. And as we're obedient and we fulfill what God wants to do in our lives, He's going to bring us safely through, but He's going to allow others to do what? To show us favor and to show us kindness, what? Along the way. I think about this. I remember as a young person, I was probably, at the time, I was like 24 years old. And at that time, God had called me to do missionary work for a summer up in northern Alberta, up in Canada with the native Canadians. And we worked in a native village up there the whole summer for 8 weeks. Myself and another man that was a college roommate of mine that I knew. And the reality is that I didn't have any way of paying for that. How am I going to take off the whole summer in order to do that? And it was 8 weeks. But you know what? God, through His people, provided what I needed in order to get and to accomplish the work that He wanted me to do. Why? Because it was God's people that God laid on the hearts of people to do what? To show kindness to me, and not only for me, but to my friend who went along with me, to provide for our needs for the whole summer, to be able to go and do the missionary work. Because I knew that that's what God called me to do, that's what God calls to do, and God provided and made a way for us to come through. And I trusted Him to do that, and God used His people to help us along the way. And that's what God did with Paul here. Okay, here they were. They were They could have been killed, but they're brought safely. Now God's showing them kindness. Let's go on here. Point number 2. It says, they're bitten by a viper. Acts 28, verses 3 to 6. Uh-oh, here it comes again. Well, Paul just got out of the shipwreck. Now, there's a viper snake, which are poisonous. And so they lit a fire because it's probably damp and cold and wet from the storm. And that's all they had. And so, all of a sudden, out of the sticks comes this viper and latches onto Paul's hand. Here's the big old viper hanging on Paul's hand. And so Paul could have just died there, and that would have been it, and that would have been the end of the story for Paul. Remember what did God call Paul to do? God called Paul to do what? Remember we were talking about going to Rome and talking to the Roman leaders. So Paul wasn't done yet. And even though a viper, the enemy can send a viper, the enemy can send anything along the way to stop what God, to try and stop what God wants to do through us, but God has a plan and has a purpose that He wants to accomplish along the way. And here's this old viper, and latched on Paul's hand, could have bit Paul. And what does Paul do? It says, Paul was bitten by the viper snake. Now that was verse 3. Now look at verse 4. I want to read verse 4 because this is really important. It says, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man, a murderer. They're assuming that he was a murderer because they don't know. They're assuming that he's a murderer. They're making judgments which they don't know, but they're just assuming that. And they said, and though he had been saved from the sea, in other words, they recognized that he was saved from the storm, justice has not allowed him to live. So they're assuming at that point, because they saw the viper, and obviously so, that if you see someone that's getting bitten by a poisonous snake and you don't have any medical facilities around, you're assuming that that person's going to die. So they're assuming that because Paul got bit by the snake, that he did something wrong. That's the way people think. A calamity comes on you because you did something wrong. That's what their thinking was. He escaped judgment because he was a murderer from the sea. So now, well, he couldn't escape too far because the snake bit him, and now he's going to die. They're assuming that because he got bit by a snake, he's going to die. Automatically, that's it. That's the way people think, in the natural, don't they? That's natural thinking. In other words, that's not spiritual thinking. Spiritual in the sense of God's mind and God's heart. Man thinks that way from man's outer perception, from man's outer viewpoint, from man's vantage point. He sees things for the way they are in the natural, but he doesn't see things beyond the natural. All he sees is what's right in front of him. All he sees is what he can touch, he can feel, he can see, he can hear, he can smell. And he makes his decision, he makes his choices, he makes his judgment based on the natural, rather than seeing things from the spiritual. But people aren't, sometimes, if they don't know the Lord, they're not spiritual people, and so they cannot understand, they cannot see things from the spirit realm, because the Spirit of God is not inside them in order to enable them to see things. So they were assuming things for the worst for Paul. But God had other plans. Because why? Because God wanted Paul to go where? God wanted Paul to go to where? Rome. He wanted Paul to go to Rome so that he could preach to whom? To Caesar and to the Roman leadership. And let's go on here. And it says, verse 5 says, Paul shakes the snake off into the fire and suffers no harm. Because Paul got bitten by a snake, did that faze Paul? What did Paul know in his mind? Paul knew in his mind that God had given him a purpose, God had given him a reason, God had given him direction, God showed him, I want you to go to Rome, I want you to preach there, and I got you through the storm, and you know what, Paul? I'm going to get you through the snake bite as well. You're not going to die. And so Paul had the confidence in his heart. He wasn't afraid, but he trusted in his God. Because as God told him, I'm taking you to Rome, and I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to provide for you. And one little old viper snake, which is poisonous, is not going to do anything. So he says, He shakes him off and goes where? The snake goes in the fire. So Paul's confidence was not in what he could see. His confidence was in his God, who was over the snake, who was over nature, who created the snake. Wasn't in his circumstances. And so often what happens is that we put our confidence in what we can see and what we can feel, we can hear, we can touch, and we look at those, and that's where we make our judgment and our decisions from, rather than looking at it from God's perspective and God's vantage point, and God's called us to do something, and we know that He's called us, and He knows it, and we're confident that He's going to do it. Then by golly, we're going to trust Him. Don't look at your circumstances and say, this is the way it's going to be based on your circumstances. Don't look at that, because it's not what you see that's reality with your eyes. What reality is what God says is reality. That's what reality is, not with your eyes, not with your ears, not what you feel, not what you hear, not what your emotions are. That's not reality. What God says is reality is reality. And so Paul knew that. And he shook that snake off, and the snake was gone. That was it, done. And God was going to accomplish His purpose. But the natives are still thinking, surely this man's going to die. But let's look at verse 6. The natives were expecting Paul to get sick or to die. Let's look at verse 6. It says, but they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. That's what happens when you get bit by a viper snake, isn't it? What happens? So they're just assuming, it says after a long time had passed. And Paul's still, hanging out. Paul's still, he's still alive and well. He didn't swell up like a balloon. He didn't pass over and keel over and die. He was wide awake. He was energetic. No sign at all of having ever been bit by a snake at all. None. And so the natives going, what's going on here? Well, let's go on. Let's see what they were saying. And it says, at the end of verse 6, it says, but they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him. They changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. See, in other words, it was a supernatural thing. They recognized at that point that this was a supernatural thing. So they were thinking that in their mindset and their understanding, they don't know God, but in their mindset and their understanding, they're thinking that, well, the only way Paul survived was because he was a god. See, they didn't necessarily attribute it to a work of God. They assumed that Paul was a god. So the reality is that, again, they're looking at it from what? A natural perspective, rather than looking at it as a supernatural perspective of God working through someone and God taking care of someone. Well, let's go on here. Healings and provisions. That's our third point. And this is verses 7 through 10. It says, Publius, he was a leader on the island, welcomed and entertained Paul and the men with him for 3 days. Again, what's God doing here? God is taking care of Paul and the people with him. Remember, this is 275 people that were on that ship. That must have been a pretty big ship. And here, the people on the island are treating not only Paul, but the people with him with kindness. And they entertained Paul, and they took care of him. See how God provides. See how God had a purpose for Paul? God provides for Paul through people. God provides Paul through people. People who have resources. People who can provide at that time. And God was putting on their hearts to be able to provide for them and care for them. And take care of them. God was taking care of Paul. And so does He with us. Again, as we're going along in our journey, and God told us to do something and we're doing it, God will provide for your needs, and God will allow people to show you kindness, and God will allow people to show you and provide for you provision. You can trust that, because your God will never, it says, what did He say? I will never leave you, nor what? Nor forsake you. What does it say? What did he say in his word? It says in the Lord's Prayer, which we cite every Sunday, give us this day what? Our daily bread. What does that mean? That God's going to provide for you your daily provision. He's going to take care of you. He's going to meet your needs. Look at the sparrow. They neither, how they daily, they go around and they pick up things and a little food. And God provides for them. The flowers, they neither toil nor spin, yet they're clothed even greater than Solomon was. The reality is that God takes care of his people, and God uses people to provide for his people. You know, the funny thing is that if you look in the United States, most of your Christians, some of your Christians are some of the wealthiest people in this country. And they provide philanthropically for God's work. And God's work can happen as God uses people to provide for needs. And God will provide for our needs. And then God will use us to provide for other people's needs. There's been times where God has used me, or my wife, or my family, to help provide for others in need. So they can do the work of God. And they can accomplish the plan that God has for them. And vice versa. So it works, the body works together to do that. But that's the way God does things. God wants to do something, he'll provide the way in order for it to happen. And that's what was happening here. But then, the father, verse 8, the father of Publius gets sick, and Paul is able to pray for and lay his hands on him to heal him. Well, let's look at verse 8. It says, and it happened that the father of Publius was laying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. That was pretty painful. And Paul went to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. So here, Paul's going to Rome. And Paul has a purpose, he has a plan. I'm going to Rome. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I just want to get to Rome, and I want to do what God's called me to do. And that's good. But along the way, God has other things that he wants to do along the way, and he needed to take the time. Paul recognized, and Paul is mature enough in his faith to understand that he needed to take the time for people along the way. Well, this wasn't on the itinerary, God, so I can't do this. I need to find a way to get to Rome. I need to find a way, God. This wasn't in the schedule, God. This guy getting sick, I can't waste any more time. I need to get to Rome. But Paul recognized the Spirit of God. When the Spirit of God says, okay, Paul, I know that we need to get to Rome. I have a plan, I have a purpose. But also I want you to use you right now, at this time, this moment, to speak to Publius, and to pray for him so that he can have healing in his life. So sometimes God will take us on a little side path, but the path brings us back to where we need to be. But God wants to use us along the way, and God will use us for healing. It may seem like an inconvenience, but the reality is that God used Paul in a tremendous way. What a testimony. What a testimony to those people. Paul took a moment of his time to be able to go and to be able to do what? To heal, to pray for, and to heal, be able to heal Publius's father. May not seem like a big deal, but it was a big deal. And how many times do we not take the time? We do take the time, or we don't take the time. Just pray for those little things. Like someone's hurting. This is why I always make a purpose. If someone tells me they need prayer, or someone tells me that, and I have things to do, and someone's hurting, or I pray for them right then and there. I don't say, okay, be well, brother, I'll pray for you later. I don't do that. I take the time and I take the moment to pray for them there. God hears us, folks. It's just not Pastor John or the pastor or the leader that can pray for people. It's us. Because God hears us, doesn't he? Just doesn't hear me because I'm a pastor. I'm not any better than all of us. I'm not. But God wants to use us to be able to pray for people. People says, I'm hurting. Maybe they're emotionally, they're in a relationship that they're struggling with. And well, can we just pray? Take a moment praying for them. Or they're hurting physically or mentally or emotionally. However, we take the time and the moment to be able to say, okay, I'm going to pray for you. And you believe God. If they need healing, pray for their healing. God can use us to heal. He's used me. I've seen folks get healed, folks. I have. God can, doesn't mean, just because I'm a pastor, doesn't mean I'm anything greater. I'm not. But the reality is God can use us as well. Paul took the time out of his schedule, because even though he had something he needed to do, he took the time to be able to pray for this man. What a tremendous impact. Let's listen to what happens after that. And verse 9 says, others who were sick come and get healed. Let's look at verse 9. It says, after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. What had happened if Paul didn't take the time to do Publius? What happened to the rest of the people? They probably wouldn't have had the courage to come. Would they? And so when we're obedient to God and we take the time to do things along the way, along the journey, in our path, what God calls us to do, is that others are blessed as a result. For example, when you take the time to pray for that person, when somebody's hurting, and you just take the time to pray for them, or they have a need and you're able, and God's putting on your heart to be able to give to them. And God, and they're blessed by that. Then others hear about it, and what happens? They're blessed as well, aren't they? Aren't they? And they're encouraged as well, and they're strengthened as well. See, our little act of kindness, our little act of obedience to God, not only helps that person, but it helps others. We hear about that. As a result was, our act of obedience doesn't affect one person, but it affects multitudes of people as well. And who knows what the effect of that healing on that island had. Because in my reading about this island, is that there's many leaders. You don't know what the effect of Paul healing the father Publius or healings of these people. You don't know what effect that had on future generations and other people on that island who came to that island. You don't know how that could have affected them. And you never know how our actions, when we're obedient to what God tells us to do, we take the time to do it, even the smallest thing, the smallest act of kindness, the smallest word of encouragement, the smallest prayer, the smallest gift that you give to someone, you don't know how that will affect you or affect people that come after them. You don't know the effects. Because that small act of kindness could have ramifications that go generations. Generations. You don't realize that. But God does, doesn't He? Doesn't He? I used to work with the homeless for years and years and years, long, long time. And I've seen a lot of, especially with a lot of the folks I work with, I've seen a lot of tragic situations, tragic difficulties in people's lives. But often God told me never to look down on folks because maybe they have less than you do, and never to look down on them in a condescending way. But to be kind, to be gracious with them, to be kind to them. And those little acts of kindness, I remember God told me one time I was in the mission in Atlantic City. This was way back when. This is way before probably even Hunter was born. Way back then. And there was a little young boy, a mom, single mom, and she was struggling with a lot of things going on. And I was a chaplain. I was working at the afternoon shift from 3 to 11 at that time. I was in the front office, and it was during chapel time, and I had opportunity to, this mom came in and she had her young son. She asked, could you watch him? I want to attend his service. Because we had a, and so I had this little boy, and God told me to take this little young boy and you pray for him. You pray for him. And you lift him up. And God, I prayed for that young man, and this was probably over 30 years ago. Over 30 years ago. And the reality was, I don't know whatever happened to that young man, but the reality of that one moment and my obedience to God told me, you need to pray for this young child, that God would spare him, that God would protect him, and God would fulfill his purpose for him. I believe that that was purposeful because God told me to do it at that moment, and that God told me that something was going to happen to this young man, that God had a purpose for me and wanted me to pray. So that little moment, that little act of obedience to God could affect a generation in this young man's life, whose life was difficult because his mom was a single mom with difficulties of her own. And here was a child that God told me, you need to pray for him right now. Lift him up to me. Dedicate him to me. It was a little moment in time, but I believe that God used that to affect that young man's life. I never heard anything back from him. I don't know what happened to him. The reality was is that I trusted God to do what He told me to do, that little act of kindness. And the same thing with Paul. The act of kindness or healing could affect generations. Our acts of kindness, our acts of obedience for God along the way, with little things, can affect generations and whole groups and nations and people for Him. And let's finish up here. It says, and listen to this, the first part of verse 10, it says, the people honored Paul and those with him with many acts of respect. Let's look at that. Verse 10, it says, they also honored us with many marks of respect. So think about that. They honored us. When you do God's work, what happens is that in the eyes of the people, what ends up happening? God allows the people to be able to do what? To show you respect and honor. Not that they're disrespecting God, not that they're honoring God above you, but they allow you to be respected and honored in their own eyes. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. And they can't, and I know as a man, the biggest thing that a man can do, a man needs love, but what a man needs is a man needs respect. He needs respect. And the reality is, and the Bible even talks about that. It says, husbands, love your wives, and Christ loved the church. And it says, wives, respect your husbands. And the reality is that men need respect. And what were the people doing here for Paul as a result of this? They were respecting and doing what? And honoring him. So when we're obedient to God, and we're doing what God tells us to do, and we're doing those little things that God shows us to do, the reality is that God will allow us to receive the respect that we need and the honor that we need. Not that we're receiving God's honor, because God gets His honor. But God, and you can't tell me how that feels, even as people, that you get respect and you get honor. And it encourages your heart, it builds up your heart, it really does. It really does. And then lastly, well, listen to how God does this. And it says, when Paul was ready to sail, they supplied him with all that he needed for the journey to Rome. Listen to the end part of it, verse 10. And when we were ready to set sailing, he supplied us with all we needed. God wanted Paul to go to Rome. But God had a couple of things along the way that He wanted to do before He got to Rome. And if Paul was obedient, and Paul did what God told him to do, like the healings and with any of the other things that Paul was doing, what did God do? God provided for Paul all that he needed. It's not something, but all that he needed for the journey, to complete the journey. All. All means everything that he needed for the journey. Provided a new ship so they could go to Rome. Everything. Same thing with us, folks. As we're obedient and God tells us to do, and we do what God tells us to do, and we follow through, God will provide everything we need along the way to get us to the end, to get us through our journey. We don't have to worry. We don't have to fear. We need to just trust Him to do it as we are obedient. Will He do it? Yes, He will. Why? Because His words and promises are what? Yea and amen. I will do what? I will never leave you, nor what? Nor forsake you. He's our Father. He's a good Father. He's a good Father. But we need to be obedient along the way, and we need to do what He says to do, and watch what happens along the way. When God tells us to do something, no matter what obstacles or trials comes, He will always bring us safely through. He will protect us along the way. When we're obedient to what He tells us, He will allow us to show favor, be shown favor and kindness by people. God can use us to pray for and see healing for people, and not just physical healing. And when we do those kind things, God will use us to see great things happen for people. We need to take the time to do it. And there will be times when people will honor us and respect us. And we need to receive that and accept that. Because that builds us up and does what? It encourages us, doesn't it? And then lastly, it says, as we are in God's will, God will use His people to supply our needs so His work can continue. I've never, and lastly, I've never been without. Sometimes we're lean, but I've never been without. As I've been obedient to God's work, and God's will, and God's plan, I've never been without, folks. Never, ever, ever. Never missed a meal. Never missed a meal, folks. Always had a roof over my head. Always had clothes on my back. Always. Because why? Because my God says, and He will supply all your needs according to what? According to His riches in what? Glory. Be obedient to Him. He's fulfilled His plan, fulfilled His purpose. As Paul's coming to an end next week, we're going to find out that Paul goes to where? Rome. And we're going to find out how God completed Paul's journey and Paul's plan for him and for the church.